I did a big analysis of ChatGPT, and I was pretty surprised that when ChatGPT first came out, I know that the people who made it, and I said, "Did you know it was going to work?" And they said, "No." That's none of us knew it was going to work. If you looked at its predecessors, they didn't work well, and suddenly ChatGPT started working. And I even wrote a little piece about how it works, and it even exists now as a book. And I just saw this today for the first time. But let me show you. I wonder if I have some pictures here. Well, the basic strategy of what ChatGPT is doing is it's taking sort of everything, a trillion words, basically, from the web, from a bunch of books, things like that. And it's saying, given that I was started with the words, the best thing about AI is its ability to, given what I saw on the web, what's the next word likely to be? That's it. That's its basic strategy. And it just keeps doing that word by word. And it's kind of remarkable. Nowadays, these things have, it used to be 4,000. It's now more than that, a window of words that it pays attention to. It's generating one word at a time, but yet it manages to maintain sort of coherence by having a large window of words that it can look back to. Okay, so the question is, and so you can kind of go and see, got some nice pictures perhaps. That's rather uninteresting. That's just how neural nets get trained. But you can kind of look inside. Oh, there's a piece of the brain of ChatGPT. It's kind of fun. That's sort of an encoding of a mixture of human knowledge and human language somewhere deep inside GPT-3, I think, in this case. One question is, what is this doing? Why does it work? One thing to realize about it is that it is ultimately a neural net where everything just flows through from the beginning to the end. Once you've trained a ChatGPT, you're feeding it words so far, and it is just rippling through this big neural net that happens to have 175 billion weights in this particular case, and telling you what the probabilities for the next word should be. So it's doing, in a sense, a very shallow computation. It's doing, I think it's a few hundred layers deep. But it's just like, given a word, it's going to ripple through and figure out probabilities for next words. And the thing to realize that it's not doing is that irreducible computation that I talked about. It's just rippling through and saying, what's the next word going to be? And the only way that it gets to do a non-trivial computation, it can actually do universal computation in principle, is by looking. You kind of get to see all the steps that it shows, because every time it generates a new word, it looks at all the words it's generated before. And that's its only way of kind of having a recursive process of doing things. But in any case, as the thing that it ends up being a rather shallow computation relative to the kinds of things that we see in typical irreducible computations, even in cases of very simple programs. So there's a difference between what we see, for example, in nature, where we see many irreducible computations happen that go for a long way, and what we see in something like ChatGPT. And the thing to realize, if we ask, well, why does ChatGPT actually work? I think the answer is that it's something that Aristotle might have got to, but didn't quite get there. And it's the following thing. So people find it remarkable that ChatGPT can do logic. Well, how did Aristotle come up with logic? Well, he looked at a bunch of, we don't know really, but a sort of a model for it would be, he looked at a bunch of examples of rhetoric, a bunch of arguments that people have made, and said, oh, there are these patterns in the arguments people made. Those patterns are syllogistic logic. Those are these particular forms of syllogism where one thing is deduced from another. And that's what ChatGPT is seeing in lots of the text that it finds on the web. It's seeing essentially syllogisms, because it sees when you get this and this and this, it gives this. So it sort of discovers syllogistic logic. But it discovers more than syllogistic logic. It discovers, in a sense, what one might call a semantic grammar of language, I think. So in language, we're used to the idea that there is a syntactic grammar, a grammar where, for example, we know that nouns and verbs go together in certain ways. We know different parts of speech match up in certain ways. But we don't have a similar kind of thing that goes at a more semantic level of asking, what are the ways in which, how do you put together words in ways that make some sense? Making sense is different from actually being realized in the world, but at least makes sense, so to speak. And, there were lots of experiments that were done in the 1600s, actually, on so-called philosophical languages. Some more recent work that's been done. I've long been interested in the question of whether in a sense, our Wolfram language, computational language, is for a large number of domains, a language that gives you this kind of semantic grammar, a language that allows you to specify meaningful things about lots of kinds of domains. It doesn't cover all domains. It doesn't cover a lot of domains of typical everyday human discourse. It covers domains that are relevant for understanding things like the natural world. But in any case, that's the kind of, I think, the reason that ChatGPT can work is that we humans are making use of some essentially a semantic grammar that is, in a sense, a further version of logic that it's managed to piece together, so to speak. And there's probably a much more efficient way of doing what it does by just directly using that kind of symbolic semantic grammar. But in any case, by the way, a thing that I wrote something about, and maybe you'll see some more about in due course, is once you have something like ChatGPT that is dealing with human language, it becomes kind of a way of being a linguistic interface to things in the world. So you might just have a set of bullet points about, I want to say this and this and this. Okay, you tell it, make a whole essay about that, and it can do that. But, what it's doing is constructing text that is kind of, text that is kind of like what you would expect it to be based on the text that it read from the web. It can't do these sort of irreducible computations. But if it could use tools like we humans use tools, then it could do those things. If, for example, it could call Wolfram Alpha, which conveniently happens to have a natural language interface, then it would be able to ask things and actually do those computations. So maybe something that you can find something I wrote about this in January, and maybe more will happen along those lines in the rather near future. But I'll just mention one thing maybe, which is kind of thinking about what is the world like when the world is run by AIs, and what is that? What does it feel like to be in a world that's run by AIs? So, much of what the AIs do is things which will not be comprehensible to us, and we can expect. So in a sense, there's all this computation going on, and it's computation that we can, essentially the point is that once we have a situation where kind of there are AIs everywhere, so to speak, it is very similar to the situation that we already have with nature. Nature is already running all these computations. We exist around nature, so to speak. And we have found ways to, there's also more to say about this kind of observer theory business and how that relates to the way we perceive nature and the way we perceive kind of the civilization of the AIs. But I suppose the thing that perhaps is a useful place to end perhaps is it's the beginning of the thing I wrote yesterday, but anyway, is this idea that when the world is full of AI computation, it is in a sense nothing new, because the world is already full of computation in nature. And the question of then how we interact with those AIs that happen to be things that we constructed is a different question that I tried to address a bit in the thing I wrote yesterday. All right, I should stop there. Thanks.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI.